My name is Arnav Vig. I am in Dallas, Texas, and my project was Infrastructure Without Intimidation: How India has engaged with Chinese-led multilateral lending institutions from 2001 to 2020. So before I start, I would like to give a quick shout out to my mentor, Tim Marple, for exposing me to ways of thinking I had no idea existed. This Polygence project was really transformative in my academic journey because I feel like it was really important to get exposure to research. I had not been exposed to being able to question things in the way I did now, to be able to think about information and data in such a different way. So thank you for that again. So let's get started. A general introduction and context. Since 2001, China has really been expanding its geopolitical and economic presence around the world in these institutions. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. So that marks a significant year in its expansion into the global institution area. And India, on the other hand, also strives to upgrade its infrastructure and to integrate its economy into the greater region in Asia and the world. So since China's systems are mostly infrastructure centric and India wants infrastructure too, both countries want integration and to be able to engage with the world. It really makes a good point for them to cooperate. As I said in the third point, both countries have put aside their historically sour bilateral ties for mutual benefits. So India and China did fight a war in 1962 and have had many border standoffs since then. So bilateral ties have not been strong, but both countries have been very willing to put that aside and to focus on the benefit that both can get. So two institutions that they have really cooperated in are the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank. So these two are banks that are led by China, and the Belt and Road Initiative is a completely Chinese-owned initiative to build infrastructure and lend to countries to be able to further those kind of goals within their things. So as we get into the next slides, the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, the two positive forms of cooperation. Now, India played a key role in founding both of these institutions alongside China, so the cooperation was there from the start. Now we can see in both institutions, there is a high amount of lending going on, 29 billion for the AIIB and 25 billion for the NDB. And the Indian government has consistently spoken optimistically and supportively about these. So we see a lot of cooperation going on, not much animosity. And one key way to understand a possible cause for this is to see the stakeholders of these organizations. Now, neither is 51% owned by China. They are all spread across regions. You can see throughout the world: China, India, Russia, Germany, South Korea, Brazil, and South Africa. So we see participation from around the world. The stakeholding is split up. So it's a very democratic process in the way these institutions are run. Now, when we move on to the Belt and Road Initiative, it's a unilateral initiative by China to lend for infrastructure, and India has refused to engage with it. In fact, India has constantly slammed it for threatening Indian sovereignty. We can see in the next quote that India was very frank in sharing the sovereignty issue concern with China. Now, an interesting thing with the Belt and Road Initiative is that the Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan, when China lended this money to Pakistan, it allegedly includes multiple strategic benefits for the Pakistan army. Now, India and Pakistan have had a lot of military confrontations as well, so not good bilateral relationships here either. And allegedly, according to many analysts, the BRI in Pakistan allows for China-Pakistan military collusion. So from an Indian point of view, you have the possibility of two of India's strongest adversaries colluding against it through this BRI. So that is another thing that really makes India not like the BRI. But when I looked at this information originally, and I just read a lot about this topic, I guess this begs the question: why does India refuse to participate in the BRI when India and China have shelved bilateral animosity to cooperate in the AIIB and NDB? What makes the BRI different? So as we talked about in the previous two slides, this could be either because of the corporate structure that China completely controls the BRI and not the other two institutions, the AIB and NDB. This could be because of the military threats of collusion between adversaries. So to answer this question, I decided to take the time range 2001 to 2020. 2001, I mentioned earlier, is when China joined the World Trade Organization, and 2020 is when India and China had their worst border clash in decades. A total of roughly 45 soldiers were alleged to be killed on the Chinese side, 20 from the Indian side. So we have high levels of casualties, and that really just threw bilateral ties into such a negative that it could possibly affect this. Now, to study this, I drew on investment data and the Indian government statements to assess perceived security threats and engagement levels. So the engagement levels were how much the investment was, as I said earlier, and the perceived security threat is just generally, does India see a threat from this organization or not? Now, we're assuming that China seeks a near global hegemony, meaning that they're trying to expand their presence. Now, the Indian government definitely believes that, as we can see from statements that I'll show later. But the point being is that we are trying to assume that the Indian point of view is driving India's reaction, not necessarily what may or may not be true. So without that, let's go to the quotes. So I mostly relied on quotes to try to assess the mindset. The first quote is from the Indian Prime Minister, who said, "The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a result of collaborative efforts of Asian countries to provide a better tomorrow to our people. As developing countries, we share similar challenges. One of them is to find resources for the provision of infrastructure. I am happy that the theme of this year's meeting is mobilizing finance for infrastructure, innovation, and collaboration." So we can see a very positive outlook here. The Indian Prime Minister is clearly believing that India and China can use this cooperation to further the interests of the developing world and to tackle common challenges. But on the other hand, with the BRI, India shared that the issue was sovereignty. Sovereignty is the key word. Now, sovereignty is very related to national security because national security inevitably threats a nation's sovereignty, its ability to govern itself effectively. So if I go back to the previous slides, let me just go back to where I had the AIB and NDB. We have $29 billion and $25 billion, really high numbers, and we've spoken optimistically about it. The corporate structure that I said I would come back to, the corporate structure does allow for, we see the BRI is completely controlled by China, but the AIIB and NDB are not completely controlled. So China cannot embed security linkages in the AIIB and NDB because with a 27% stake, you're not going to be able to push in military benefits. Versus in the BRI, the next slide I mentioned, it's unilateral. China controls all the lending. So China can include its military benefits. And as I mentioned in the last bullet point for this, India at least believes that it has in the China-Pakistan military collusion alleging. So if we come back to the end of this, in conclusion, India assesses a security threat from the BRI and not the AIIB or NDB. And this, I believe, prompts a variation in diplomatic and economic engagement. The refusal to participate in the BRI, the cold shouldering, versus the warm-hearted welcome for the AIIB and NDB. So we can ultimately see that India prioritizes economic pragmatism over bilateral disputes, as shown in its willingness to engage with the AIIB and NDB despite frosty bilateral ties. But national security reigns supreme. If the BRI threats its national security right now, it will not engage with the institution at the cost of its national security. So why is this relevant? Well, India and China are projected by many to become the largest and the second largest economies within the century. So understanding these two countries' interactions with each other is crucial. Through this kind of research, we can predict future India-China relationships and multilateral cooperation, try to expand on the findings from this study to see what will happen in our post-COVID era. And then we can somewhat extrapolate results to other developing countries such as Vietnam or the Philippines, Malaysia, which all have South China Sea disputes with China. How will they interact with China? Will they also prioritize their national security? Do they need the money more? Of course, we have to account for the circumstances, but this research really gives us a founding point to try to study China as a whole and its interactions with the other developing countries in the Asian region. So I think now I will pause sharing my screen and try to get back into there. So I think my 10 minutes is up now. Any questions?
Arnav, thank you so much. This was an incredibly insightful presentation. Any questions from the audience? Before I jump in, I have so many questions. Or from the co-presenters. Anyone has questions? Okay, while others are thinking about their questions. So Arnav, it seems that perceived security threat level is an important concept here. Can you share with us how it's measured?
Yes, so the perceived security threat is pretty much a yes, a moderate, or a no. Now, I didn't find any moderates in this study, but I did say that in the AIIB, the perceived security threat is 0 because the Indian government has not mentioned it. If the Indian government doesn't mention it, then we have no way of seeing that, yes, it does perceive anything. So we have to say it doesn't. But in the BRI, India has constantly spoken about the threat to its sovereignty, specifically related to the Pakistani-controlled Kashmir. And therefore, we can assume that, yes, India does perceive a security threat there. So this ended up being a yes, no, rather than a scale, which I thought it originally might, but yeah.
Got it. Thank you. That's very helpful. Any other questions from the audience? Feel free to drop it in the Q&A or into the chat. All right, Arnav, I have one more question. What was for you the biggest surprise as you went through this multi-month long research project?
So I think the biggest surprise was just how the research project panned out, because I was really expecting to just be doing a lot of data digging and trying to put numbers into a presentation, but it ended up to be a lot of reading. And the surprise, I guess, was that I didn't even know what research question I was going to answer until the third or fourth week. So I was almost halfway through when I knew exactly what project I was doing. I guess at some point it frustrated me a little bit, but by the end of it, I really learned that not limiting myself to the exact question, just exploring the topic, it allowed me to do so much more research than I would have been able to before. Just being able to find what is the best topic to talk about, what is the best question to answer, and explore my topic in whole that I wouldn't have been able to do if I had decided the question in week 1. So I'm really grateful that my mentor didn't commit me originally. He let me explore everything. He told me to explore everything and question everything and find the topic that was best suited for the project.
That's awesome. And how did you pick the topic?
So I made a list. He told me to make a list of questions that I could possibly answer, start researching each and every one of those. And when I started exploring more, I eventually narrowed down that this is the crux of what I'm trying to find the puzzle in. So I knew I wanted to study the BRI and India. So we made different questions about it, and this just ended up encapsulating the whole relationship. So I was able to really explore a lot of things and center on the one thing that I thought exemplified the whole meaning of this project and what I wanted to explore in this topic.
Well, Arnav, it was a very insightful and exciting presentation about a topic that I believe many of us don't know a lot about. So thank you so much for putting in all the effort and for presenting it so well to us.
And thank you for listening, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Arnav.